Secondly, factor weights that favor zero marking in the variable rule framework are indicated in bold. So all factor weights that are over 0.5 are indicating that the favorable applications are marked. So you can see fairly clearly what's favoring and what's disfavoring the rule application. The overall rule application here is one that deals with zero. So we're sorting for the zero marking rather than the presence of S. And in fact, in some of the Creole varieties, we're counting both S's and M's as instance of the realization of the plural. Also, I've reversed the ordering of the factors in the table. For those of you who know this and other tables by heart, so that I begin with the phonological segments and then I come to the grammatical and semantic segments. And then probably most important, the language variety groupings are slightly different. Hoplak et al. Group Liberian settler English, this one here is included in dotted lines. They group Liberian settler English with the Pidgin Creole over here, rather than with the diaspora varieties. They group also the ex-slave recordings together with the diaspora recordings together as early African American English, what I'm calling it window varieties. And these groupings strike me as problematic in two respects. I think for one thing, Liberian settler English should not be excluded from the other diaspora varieties. It was settled in the 19th century in much the same way as the other settlements. By the way, when I talk about diaspora, they are talking about the African American diaspora. For those of you who may not be familiar with the work, these are cases where we're looking at African Americans, and that's by the time they immigrated, most of them were African Americans rather than Africans, who, through various colonization efforts, through other historical developments, immigrated to other parts of the world, either to Nova Scotia or to Samana in the Dominican Republic or to Liberia. So Liberian settler English was settled in the 19th century, much the same as the other settlements. And Singler makes arguments similar to those made by Hoplak and Tagliamante about the settlers having been an enclave community relatively resistant to linguistic and cultural influences from surrounding communities. In fact, the similarity between the Liberian settler English overall weighted plural marking, which is 0.30, and that of the other diaspora varieties, compare African Nova Scotia English is 0.34, argues for the inclusion of Liberian settler English in the diaspora group, as does its sharp difference from the rate from non-settler Liberian English, that is, the varieties in Liberia that don't result and aren't connected to language spoken by African American settlers who went back to Liberia, which is 72%. So that non-settler Liberian English is clearly much more like Nigerian Pidgin English, Creole consonants. Secondly, on this side over here, I think the ex-slave recordings should be separated from the diaspora varieties if only as a subgrouping of the window varieties. Because the ex-slave recording speakers have lived continuously in the United States, and they are themselves the exemplars of 19th century parents as against their descendants, in the case of the diaspora varieties. The ex-slave recordings were generally made much earlier than the diaspora recordings, so they were made in 1935 to 1944 rather than in the 1980s. And the interviewees in these cases were born between 1844 and 1861. So I think despite problems of representativeness, these ex-slave recordings are the closest thing we have to a genuine early African American English in recorded form, and we should set them apart from the others for historical comparison. So in view of these considerations, I've separated the varieties into two broad categories. Pidgin and Creole varieties on the right, window varieties on the left, with the former, the window varieties subdivided into ex-slave recordings and the diaspora varieties. I'll only make a little use of this subdivision today, but I think it's a pretty important one. And then other, let me say a bit more about the table as a whole to help to orient you to it. Students who kindly listened to me last week said I need to do a little bit more orientation. I think you now understand what we have going across the top here, the different varieties. Down the side here we have 4 different factor groups, the following phonological segment, the preceding phonological segment, type of noun or reference, and the antecedent noun. And within each factor group, we have the individual factors that are being considered. And what we have in the cells are the variable rule values or weights that tell us the relative contribution of this factor to zero marking or not. So when we see 0.58, that means that non-sibilant constants favor rule application, favor 0, 0.27 disfavors 0, or favors marking by S or down. These are the brackets. Just to quickly make a few other points here that when we made factor weights in bold greater than 0.50. Square brackets throughout the table indicate that the factor group was not statistically significant. Okay, the factors in that group did not make a statistical significance in the operation sense of result. Okay, I think that's enough orientation. Let's now turn to some substantive discussion. Working from the first factor group to the last. Poplack et al. Assert that where the early African American English varieties differ from the English-based Creoles is with regard to the following phonological segment. In each of the former, but none of the latter, we observe the by now familiar effect, consonants favor 0. Now this generalization at first appears to be confirmed by the non-significance of this factor group in 4 of the 7 Pidgin Creole varieties, and by the fact that the following consonant actually disfavors 0 in 2 of them. But note that the following phonological segment is also insignificant in 1 of the early AAE varieties, that is LSE, again, Creole English. One of the Pidgin Creole varieties does show the favoring effect of a following consonant, which Poplack et al. Claim to apply in none of them, right? A point which the authors acknowledge quite remarkably in their footnote 7, as they say, it favors it in none of them, then in footnote 7 they say, with the exception of Gull, which happens like the early AAE varieties. In fact, if we examine the data more closely, in light of the variationist interest in whether a following clause happens like a consonant or a vowel, in influencing final stop deletion, see Guide 1980, it's clear that the window varieties are not at all uniform. In African Nova Scotia English and Samana, pause patterns with vowel in disfavoring 0. Only a and I forget the include explanation, I'm not going to say that. The X-ray recordings are quite different, resembling Gullah insofar as pause and consonant pattern together in favoring 0, while the vowel strongly favors the retention of C. Now, interestingly enough, Guy found this high pause effect in the cases where pause patterns more like a consonant than a vowel. He found this high pause pattern characteristic for TD deletion not only of New Yorkers, but also of all the black speakers he surveyed, regardless of the geographical location. The only exception was black speakers from Detroit, examined by both from 1969. We don't know yet what deeper significance to attach to these subgroupings. Is there historical significance to the fact that the 2 U.S. black varieties are high pause and the 2 diaspora varieties are low pause? And could the Samana low pause effect represent a retention from Philadelphia, the city from which most African American immigrants sailed to Samana? These are some of the intriguing historical questions the data raise once we free ourselves from the obsession with noting only that the window varieties pattern similarly and that their patterns differ from those of the Pidgin Creole varieties. There are similar complications when we look at the results for the second factor group, preceding phonological segment. They say simply that preceding phonological segment is selected as significant in most varieties. These share a variable process of consonant cluster simplification, though they handle epithetic vowel insertion after sibilants differently. Well, yes, but what's really interesting again is that the X-ray recordings are more like Liberian Settler English and Jamaican Creole 94, insofar as the preceding sibilant patterns with the preceding vowel in favoring S retention. But Samana English, Gullah, and Jamaican Creole 2003 all behave differently, with the preceding sibilant similar to a preceding non-sibilant consonant in favoring 0, sometimes more so.